Hello again. Today let's talk about the Hebrews, one of the great cultures of the ancient world, as you all know, having given us the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the remarkable thing about them is that they were really they had a very small population, and yet here they are, even in the modern world, still in the state now of Israel, the modern state of Israel. Let's go back in time to the ancient world and pick up the Hebrews. Long ago, right around the time of Moses. So, first of all, who were the Hebrews? And what did they accomplish? Well, who they were a band, maybe 12 tribes, at least hypothetically. That's what we know about them, according to the Bible. And they were more or less wanderers. They really didn't have a homeland as such. They wandered around. They were living, many of them, in what is now Iraq or Babylonia at that time. And we've already talked about that culture. And they wandered around. They ended up, as you all know, in the biblical lands, which are now Israel. In fact, the ancient Israel had borders very similar to modern Israel. Around the time of Moses, let's pick them up about then, which would be about 1300. Was Moses a historical figure or not? Well, we don't have independent confirmation of that, maybe. But in any case, perhaps there was some kind of figure. Certainly, at least that's how the legend goes, and that's how the Bible tells the story. So Moses may or may not have existed around 1300, but we know that the Hebrews do seem to come together and form something like a nation in that period. This is a fairly fluid period in ancient Palestine. The Hebrews obviously were not a settled group of tribes. They did come into confrontation with a number of groups there back then. Phoenicia, for example, and the other tribes, the Philistines, you perhaps know about if you've read the Old Testament. And what we know is that some of the ancient groups there, they had iron, so they had military capacities. The Hebrews seem to have picked that up from them, and they became something of a formidable force. And roughly around the time of 1200, we find them getting a lot more settled, forming something like a state. In the year about 1028, 1026, right about then, they actually form something like a monarchy, and they have their first king, and that's Saul, and he actually will reign all the way up until around 1000. He's followed by David, and you know the ancient legend about David and Goliath, and perhaps you know the story. It is a sort of a metaphor for what probably happened, that is to say, a war between the Philistines and the Hebrews, which ultimately was won by the Hebrews. And so David becomes king right around 1000, and he reigns all the way up until about 971, and after that Solomon becomes the king, and he'll reign all the way from this period up until about 922. I think I misspoke, but Solomon actually becomes the king around 961 up until 922. What did they accomplish? Well, they accomplished the building of the Hebrew state. They accomplished the emergence of a monarchy. They accomplished the settling of a territory. They built a capital which was known as Jerusalem, still the capital today. And they also, especially under Solomon, completed the old temple. As you know, nothing of that remains today except for what's called the Wailing Wall. So they accomplished quite a bit. And there were some things that Solomon in particular introduced that helped to divide the Hebrews. And ultimately, in 922, they divided into two different kingdoms. One was in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Solomon, although he has a reputation for being so wise, favored two of the tribes. One of them was the Levites, and they were the priests. The other ones were the Judites. And they were the military commanders. Today we might say generals. So there was some favoritism. It came out also in taxes, favoritism there. And as a result, there was a lot of social strife, and that's what led ultimately to the division of the Hebrews into two different states, which weakened them, obviously. If you go fast forward from there, all the way up to around 722 or so, the Assyrians, and we've met them before, the Assyrians were an expanding civilization. They were a military culture, if you remember, and they actually conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And the result was the first diaspora of the Hebrews, of the ancient Jews, many of them ending up in ancient Babylon after that. If you fast forward a little bit past that, all the way to 586, by then the Chaldeans were in power, and they will be the ones spreading out. They will be the ones conquering the remaining kingdom of Judah, and that completes the diaspora. Many Jews at that point end up in what's called Babylonian captivity. So it's a very, very tough ride for the ancient Hebrews up until this point. They're scattered. They've lost their homeland. They've lost their state. And all of this kind of translates into many of their beliefs and cultures. It's quite amazing that they were able to stay together and that ultimately they were able to return. They were able to return. In 538, the Persians come along, and the Persians actually conquer the Chaldeans. And they, as a result, take much of the Middle East, and that becomes part of what is now the Middle East, and that becomes part of their kingdom. So they allowed the Hebrews to come back. They actually come back to the land of Palestine, and there they will live kind of securely within the Persian Empire still, but they're allowed to rebuild the temple. They're allowed to worship their God again, and all seems pretty well, much improved. Let's put it like that. And they remain like that all the way up until the Roman times. And of course, things don't go so well then. In the first century after Christ, the Hebrews will again be scattered, and by 130 they suffer another diaspora, and they are again scattered, and they will not return to their homeland all the way up until the 20th century. Let's take a look now at this. This is a very brief sort of schema, really, of their political history. But what's important about the Hebrews, and the reason certainly that we remember them now so much, has to do with their religious development. They were really the first ancient culture. The Persians had some of this, but they were the first ancient culture in the West to really worship one God, Yahweh. And they certainly contribute a lot to Western civilization because of that, because this is the God also that enters into Christian lore, into Christian religion later on, Catholicism, and so on. And what's interesting to note about the Hebrews is that many of their early beliefs actually were no different than anybody else. So it's interesting that the leaders of Israel, the patriarchs, or if you want to call them the people of God, their ancient priests, or the rabbis, we might say nowadays, they were the ones who put this together. They were the ones who created the narrative. They were the ones who sort of fashioned or shaped the theology, if you will. And it took them some time to do that. The Hebrews actually originally were animists. They believed in spirits, certainly nothing like one God. And then sometime around the formation, certainly Moses, but it would be after Moses as well that these religious beliefs developed. But particularly in the time of Moses and sometime soon afterwards, the idea of monotheism emerges very clearly. In the very second stage of Hebrew religion, could be called the anthropomorphic, and that's where Yahweh, or God, has very human characteristics. If you have read your Old Testament, you'll know that God becomes very angry with the Hebrews. They fall away from him. He punishes them because they don't follow him the way they should. They don't observe the commandments, which of course Moses gets directly from God. So the second stage, the anthropomorphic stage, is when God is sort of calling the Hebrews in, telling them to act better, telling them not to engage in exploitation of each other, and really trying to sort of set the stage for a just order on earth. And it's interesting that this God is considered to be the Hebrew God, the only God, but this God is in nature. This is not a transcendent God. This is a God concerned with justice, but very punishing as well if you don't follow his commandments. Following that, and let's say the Hebrews go through a period that I've just talked about where they're in captivity. They lose their own lands. They end up somewhere else in captivity. And this is when the religion goes through yet another stage, it seems. And many of their prophets start calling the Hebrews back, saying that the reason that you are suffering, the reason you've lost your homeland, the reason that you no longer are where you want to be is because of your own sins, and because of your own transgressions. All you have to do is really follow the commandments, obey God, and everything will be much better. So the next stage that we're talking about is we go beyond the anthropomorphic stage, and we're talking now about what's called national monolatry. That may not mean much to you, but what it does signify is not only is God one, not only is there just monotheism, in other words. But God now goes through also a kind of evolution in the minds of the patriarchs, in the minds of the leaders of the Hebrews. God now becomes not just a sort of almost like human figure who gets angry and who is part of nature, present right here. He now becomes a transcendent God. He now becomes a God who's presiding over a kind of a just order, both moral order, a sort of cosmic order. He now becomes not only the single God, but a transcendent God, right? And this is a call really for Hebrews to come back to the commandments. This is a call now to obey this God who is a just God. And this is a call really to sort of redeem, for the Hebrew people to redeem themselves by no longer exploiting each other, by no longer falling away from God, by no longer observing maybe other deities. And so this is a very important stage, because a lot of these ideas emerge precisely in this period when the Hebrews are kind of in conflict with each other. So might be talking about the 8th century, 7th century, and so on. It's especially true, I would say, when the Hebrews began to when they're taken over by the Persians. That is to say, when they're allowed to come back by the Persians back to their lands. This is an important period because this is a period where they're able to kind of restore things and maybe revive their identity, revive their relationship to God, and purify themselves and seek a redemption. Now, what is interesting about this period, particularly this third period, is that the Hebrews had been influenced by the Persians themselves and by others. And what strikes me and what strikes many is that originally the Hebrews don't have the idea of a soul. They don't have the idea of immortal life. They don't have the idea of redemption. And this is something that sort of comes into their identity and into their beliefs only in about this period. And a lot of the writings really come about, well, in the 8th century, but also they following the Persians, when the Persians take over. This would be as I said, the 6th century, the 5th century, when now the Hebrews even go into the next stage, when now there's very clearly this notion of a soul. Now there's very clearly this idea of a sort of a messianic approach, a redemption of the Hebrews after all. All this is going on in the 6th century. As you recall, the Persians allowed them to come back. And it's in this period that they are able to rebuild the temple. It's in this period they're able to reestablish their relationships with God. And it's in this period predominantly that the Hebrews begin to work out really not only relationships to God, but their understanding of the meaning of life, the understanding of the meaning of history itself, and who they are, why they're here. And that is when they really begin to develop this notion of a soul, and that there is more to life than just what is here. So what do Hebrews have to do? They have to obey the commandments. They have to obey God once again. And if they simply obey their duty, if they'll give up the exploitation of others, of Jews by Jews, then it seems that they're on the way to this redemption. Which leads me to a couple of other conclusions and a couple of other points. One is that they were the first really to develop a notion of history as we know it today. Many of the ancients, the Greeks for example even, have this notion that history is actually not history as we know it, but is circular. That is to say, everything repeats itself. There is no such thing as a single event. There's no such thing as linear history. The Hebrews changed that. The Hebrews have this idea that we are all judged. History is the record of how we perform. History is the record of whether we're sinful or not. We have free will, according to the Hebrews, and it's up to us to either embrace the commandments or not to embrace them. So this idea that history is the record of judgment, the record of how we perform or don't perform, whether we sin or not, whether we prefer righteousness or not. This is how the Hebrews begin to see the relationship of God and man, that we should be part of this just order, and if we obey, if we do the right things, then we shall in fact earn the sort of redemptive reward, you might say, from all that. So the Hebrews really amongst the first to kind of enjoy this idea, or to put forward this idea that history actually means something, that how we act actually means something, and that a sort of existential idea that our lives are meaningful and what we do on this earth is also meaningful. This also means that as individuals we have value, that as individuals we have worth, and it's these kinds of ideas that are really part of this great legacy that the Hebrews have left us. So think about the Hebrews and what they accomplished, but think to a great extent about this moral order that they create, which is very much linked to their idea of religion and God. Thank you. See you soon.